So, Madam President, the Senate and the nation are closely watching the situation in the Gulf. Last week, the recent recklessness from Tehran reached a new level. Iran fired on an unmanned U.S. intelligence aircraft that was flying over international waters. This is a violent and dangerous and overt provocation, as any nation has aimed at the United States in literally years. This is not a time for partisanship. But unfortunately, we're already seeing extreme voices on the far left so afflicted by Trump derangement syndrome that they repeat Iranian talking points and advertise the absurd notion that our country, our administration, our president are somehow to blame for Tehran's violent aggression. Blame America first. By 2019, nobody should need a history lesson on Iran. But apparently some need a refresher, because there should be no question about who is at fault. Iran has disregarded international law and violated the laws of armed conflict since the first days of the Islamic Republic. Its malign activities as the world's most active state sponsor of terrorism include their crusade to destroy Israel, including sponsorship of countless terrorist attacks, the malevolence throughout the Persian Gulf, including proxies in Yemen who recently attacked civilian targets, perennial threats to close the Straits of Hormuz, a key international waterway essential to global commerce, and of course, the long-standing asymmetrical war they've waged against us, beginning with the infamous takeover of the U.S. Embassy in 1979 and the 50-plus hostages held captive for 444 days, the provision of weapons, training, funding, and direction to terrorist groups, including Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Taliban, and Shiite militias in Iraq that are responsible for the murder of hundreds of U.S. service members from Lebanon to Iraq to Afghanistan. And more attacks plotted on U.S. targets worldwide, including our own homeland. So the record is blindingly obvious, Madam President. It's why so many of us oppose the Obama administration's deal with Iran. Many of us understood the agreement not only failed to properly address the nuclear threat, but also completely ignored the other threats Iran posed to international peace and stability. In fact, some prescient members of this body warned the deal would amplify Iran's dangerous behavior. I remember back in 2015, the current ranking member on the Foreign Relations Committee insisted the Obama administration policy would invite the kind of mess we see today. Here's what he said. If there's a fear of war in the region, it will be the one fueled by Iran and its proxies and exacerbated by an agreement that allows Iran to possess an industrial-sized nuclear program and enough money and sanctions relief to significantly continue to fund its hegemonic intentions. Now, that's our colleague from New Jersey, the ranking member on the Foreign Relations Committee back in 2015. And here was my colleague from New York, the current Democratic leader. This is what he said. Under this agreement, Iran would receive at least $50 billion in the near future and would undoubtedly use some of that money to redouble its efforts to create even more trouble in the Middle East and perhaps beyond. That was the Democratic leader that same year. He acknowledged that the hardliners' number one goal is strengthening Iran's armed forces and pursuing even more harmful military and terrorist actions. That was the Democratic leader. This is exactly the situation President Trump inherited in 2017 as emboldened Tehran committed to spending its new resources on military capabilities, exporting terrorism, and pursuing regional hegemony. So President Trump was right to seek a better deal and apply maximum pressure on Tehran until it changes its destabilizing behavior. Tough sanctions are compounding the economic pain the mullahs have brought on their own people through corrupt mismanagement. Iran is responding to this legitimate and judicious application of diplomatic and economic pressure the way it effectively operated for years. What do they always do? Through violence. Attacks against commercial vessels in international waters, sponsored attacks against civilian targets in the Gulf, and then last week's unprovoked attack on our unarmed aircraft. So, Madam President, we face a choice here. Will we legitimize and incentivize Iran's use of terror and aggression? Or will we stay resolute, applying appropriate and proportionate pressure until Tehran respects fundamental norms of international behavior? Last Thursday, President Trump consulted with a bipartisan group of congressional leaders and national security chairmen and ranking members. The President weighed advice from a number of sources. It is clear he was listening to congressional leaders. And clearly the President wants to avoid war, hence the deliberate and judicious approach he's taken since the shoot-down. Hence his repeated efforts to give Iran's leaders an off-ramp toward negotiations. Nevertheless, there is a general consensus that this act of aggression cannot stand. Tehran must understand that it may not respond to legitimate diplomatic pressure with illegitimate violence. It is in our national security interest for the United States to deter attacks against American forces operating legally in international waters and to honor our long history of defending the freedom of the seas and freedom of international commerce. And since Iran's aggression and threats to global commerce threaten everyone, I hope all nations will join the U.S. and its allies in condemning Tehran and imposing significant consequences for its hostile acts. Now, look, I understand the significant appetite in Congress for the President to consult with us as he continues to deliberate. Obviously, that's appropriate. My colleagues should share their views with the administration. I understand the Foreign Relations and Armed Services Committee will be holding hearings with senior administration officials after July 4th. But what is not productive, Madam President, is an effort being promoted by the Democratic leader that would preemptively tie the hands of our military commanders, weaken our diplomatic leverage, embolden our adversaries, and create a dangerous precedent. Therefore, I will strongly oppose the Udall Amendment, which would gratuitously take crucial options off the table. It would hamstring both our commanders and our diplomats, all of whose leverage depends on the knowledge that the U.S. reserves the right to act forcefully if and when necessary. 10 years ago, my friend the Democratic leader said verbatim, when it comes to Iran, we should never take the military option off the table. That's exactly what the amendment he supports would do. Nearly every president has utilized limited use of force against adversaries without, I repeat, without pre-authorization from Congress. Nearly every president has done that. Of course, major hostilities require congressional concurrence and the support of the American people. So the Democrats should stop their fear-mongering because no one, I repeat, no one is calling for major military operations. Not the President, not his military commanders, not Republicans in Congress. This amendment would impose unprecedented limitations that would go far beyond the War Powers Resolution. As drafted, it could prevent U.S. military forces from defending themselves against attack or conducting a timely counterattack. If we had actionable intelligence that an attack was imminent, it would prevent U.S. forces from doing anything about it. If Israel was attacked, it would prevent U.S. forces from providing immediate assistance to our closest ally in the region. This amendment flies in the face of many Democrats' past clarity about Iran and casts doubt on our seriousness in defending our own military personnel, much less the freedom of the seas. Democrats must set aside the habit of unthinking reflexive opposition to every single thing this president does. That's why I called it Trump derangement syndrome. Perhaps it would help if they were reminded of what the Democratic candidate for president in 2016 had to say about what her policy would be toward Iran and the Gulf were she to be elected. Here's what Hillary Clinton had to say. I will reaffirm that the Persian Gulf is a region of vital interest to the United States. We'll keep the Strait of Hormuz open. We'll increase security cooperation with our Gulf allies, including intelligence sharing, military support, and missile defense to ensure they can defend against Iranian aggression, even if that takes the form of cyber attacks or other non-traditional threats. She went on, Iran should understand the United States, and as president, I will not stand by as our Gulf allies and partners are threatened. She concluded by saying, we will act. That's Hillary Clinton. So, Madam President, nearly every word of that statement accurately describes the policy of the Trump administration has pursued for the last 2 years. Our Gulf allies and partners are threatened by Iran. Israel is threatened by Iran. The Strait of Hormuz is threatened by Iran. And America has been attacked by Iran. The threat is not in doubt. The question is whether Democrats still mean it when they said, or whether they completely changed their minds about how the U.S. must respond simply because the White House has changed parties.